Hello everyone, this is Mr. Kozlowski and welcome to the first lecture on scientific research vocabulary. This is our first kind of lecture video. It's going to be a test run to serve and get kids used to what is expected of them with their homework. And I've gotten a lot of questions, a lot of feedback, and I'd like to take a moment to answer some of those questions. The big one that keeps coming up from students is, how will I check your homework? How will I make sure I'm watching the videos and taking notes? Well, it's very simply put. Somewhere in this video will be an annotation that pops up, and that annotation will go to a link, and that link will bring you to a quiz, and that quiz is about things that I lecture on in this video. So you need to do one of two things to get credit. One, take that quiz and submit it via Google Forms. And two, also provide notes to me in the next day. So I will be basically, every time I assign homework, the very next day, as soon as you walk into class, I'll be checking your notes to make sure you took good, proper notes on your homework. So please keep in mind those two things are required to get a good homework grade. So let's get started. Today we're talking about scientific research vocabulary. And one of the things that is awesome in science class is we get to do a lot of hands-on activities, a lot of practicing, and we do labs and experiments. And we have to know what the importance of a lab is and what our definition of a controlled experiment is. Science can be chaotic, and a lot of experiments have many different aspects and phases to them, but ultimately they're all controlled experiments. And we define in physical science a controlled experiment as an experiment with only one independent variable, and only one variable will change throughout the experiment. And this allows us to see how that thing affects your experiment, how that factor, how that variable affects your experiment. Because ultimately at the end of the experiment is you are making a comparison between that variable and what else was tested. Nothing else. That's it. One thing. And that's going to allow us to develop relationships and determine how we can apply that knowledge to other aspects within that content of that lab. So that's a controlled experiment. So let's define this a little more. Here's an example. In an experiment, we always start out with a question. So here's our question. Does fertilizer affect the growth rate of plants? So in this case, we are going to test the growth rate of plants, and we're going to use fertilizer versus no fertilizer. So if you look at this picture here below, we have a picture of plants, and we have a control and the experimental group. So there's a lot of different things that go into this, and a lot of different variables that should remain the same, but ultimately we want to test fertilizer versus no fertilizer in this case. So the control group would probably have, or most likely have, no fertilizer. The experimental group would probably be giving a dose of fertilizer, and we want to keep as many things and many variables the same throughout this experiment. So we're only testing fertilizer versus no fertilizer. I'm going to talk about these variables that stay the same a little bit later on in this lecture. So we have our question. What we have when we get our question is then we want to make a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a claim or a statement that the experimenter's prediction of what will happen in the experiment. So basically, it's your prediction. What's going to happen? What do you predict will be the result? These statements must be testable, and how we write them in science class is based off the following format. We write them in an if-then format sentence structure. They need to include both variables. They need to be specific. They should not use vague words like it or they or them. And then we do not want to use words like better or best because how do you measure those things? What are those things? What defines better? So hypothesis is going to be a very specific statement. Here are some examples of a hypothesis. If the water faucet is opened, then the amount of water flowing will increase. So you can clearly see the if and then format. Here's another one. If I raise the temperature of a cup of water, then the amount of sugar that can be dissolved in it will be increased. So those are some examples of a hypothesis. The independent variable, this is the variable that is changed. So this is what the experimenter actually controls this. So we, as the experimenters, get to determine what we're trying to test here. We're changing. So in our example here, the experimenter added fertilizer to the plant. The fertilizer in this case would be the independent variable because we controlled it. We changed one plant, added fertilizer to one, and then the second one we just left alone as our control. The dependent variable is the variable that changes as a result or according to the changes in other variables. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. That's a phrase that we have in science. So if we go back to our example here, we added fertilizer to one of the plants. That fertilizer, that change, was the independent variable. That fertilizer could have changed the plant growth, or we could say that the plant's growth rate increased. That would be the dependent variable. That is the result. So we would compare that back to the control then, and that's our dependent variable. A constant, again, we only want to test one variable, okay? We're testing fertilizer versus no fertilizer and seeing its effect on growth rate. Well, we have to keep everything else the same, and these are called constants. So a constant is a factor or variable that does not change throughout the experiment, but necessarily doesn't have the effect on growth rate. So we don't want these variables to affect the growth rate because we're only looking at fertilizer. So we keep them the same, therefore they're constant. So here are examples of those down there. The control group, this would be the standard by which test results can be compared back to, the basis of comparison. So example, we would take the plants that were not fertilized, that would be the control group, and we would compare them to the growth of the plants that were fertilized. So the control group would be no fertilizer in this case. So that's about it for experimental research. If you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck on the quiz. Don't forget to do your homework. Thanks.